It was the sort of twilight Oxford does best, diffused, deliberate, and full of things unsaid. The sort of hour when shadows stretch just long enough to remind you they've always been watching. I remember the clink of my pint glass on the scuffed table at the White Horse, a clink too sharp against the hush of the room, and the way the bell from Magdalen Tower came in hesitant pulses, as though the sound itself had second thoughts. Vespers. Even the word felt ecclesiastical, guilt-soaked, a word for people who still believed in apologies. Lewis had offered to join me, but I'd told him not to bother. He'd only have tried to talk, and I wasn't in the mood for the warmth of his intentions. I rarely was. I needed silence, or more precisely, the illusion of it. Oxford was never truly silent. There were always murmurs, of books whispering in libraries, of footsteps over wet flagstones, of bicycles sighing on their kickstands. And that night, it was a bicycle that caught me. Outside the chapel, a ghost had parked something too tangible. The bicycle, an older Raleigh, forest green, too clean for the season, leaned against the low stone wall with the formality of someone posing for a portrait. It was locked, yes, but the sort of lock one uses more for ceremony than security. No note, no helmet, no sign of the rider. It had not been there earlier. I remember that distinctly, because I'd passed that very spot before the service, trying to remember the Latin for to confess and failing, which was perhaps apt. I stood staring at it longer than was reasonable. There's something unnerving about objects that wait too patiently. The rear reflector was cracked. A single daffodil petal clung to the chain guard like an accusation. The saddle was adjusted high, suggesting a tall rider, and the leather had been oiled. Recently. Maintenance implied intent, but whose? Inside the chapel, the choir had already begun. Voices blooming against cold stone. I knew some of them, mostly by sight, stiff-backed undergraduates in ill-fitting robes, their mouths forming vowels as though each note might redeem them, one voice missing. It took me several minutes to realize it, a solo that came not at all, the pause where Alicia Mowbray's voice should have unfolded. Instead, silence stitched with confusion, filled eventually by the organ's embarrassed swell. No one said anything, of course. We're not a people who do, not in Oxford. We notice, and we nod inwardly, and we fold the discrepancy away like a telegram we intend to read later. I returned to my drink, but it tasted off, metallic and indifferent. Something had shifted. Not alarmingly so, not yet. But there was a tension in the air that didn't belong to music. Outside, the bicycle waited still. I traced the droplets on its frame with my eyes, watched how the lamplight fractured across them. It had rained earlier, one of those quick, spiteful showers Oxford specializes in, but the bicycle was dry. So it had arrived after the rain. Then, after I'd first walked past, I filed that away. The pub emptied gradually. Pints became halves, then nothing. Coats were shrugged on, murmurs exchanged, and the door sighed shut with its usual reluctant farewell. I stayed. Not out of necessity, but ritual. I'd taken to loitering in places like these in recent years. Rooms where my mind could idle just enough to allow memory to creep in, wearing its usual disguise of deduction. The older I got, the more I recognized that thinking and remembering were not separate acts. I left eventually, stepped out into streets that glistened like old coins. The bicycle remained. A challenge now, not just an anomaly. I walked past it slowly, then turned back. There were no distinguishing marks beyond a faint smudge on the rear mudguard. Perhaps pollen, perhaps something more pedestrian. A smudge in the shape of a thumbprint. I didn't touch it. I'd grown wary of interpreting the world too eagerly. But I felt something then. The case hadn't yet begun, but already Oxford had shifted. Something had happened in the space between that first bell toll and the last dying note of the choir. Something that involved silence and absence and perhaps, if I squinted metaphorically enough, penance. I looked up at the tower. The bells had stopped, but the air still held the echo of them, time delayed or regretted. And beside me, the bicycle waited, unclaimed, too dry, too placed. I knew then, though I wouldn't say it aloud for days, that something had been left behind. Not lost, not forgotten. Left. And Oxford remembers everything that is left behind. The next morning arrived with a reluctant grey, the sort of overcast that neither commits to rain nor allows light to properly settle. Oxford wears this indecision well, cloaked in mist, blurred at the edges like an old photograph. I sat at my desk too early, staring at a crossword I couldn't finish. The clue, solo undone, lost in echo, 6, struck me as irritatingly apt, though I only realized why when Lewis rang. He didn't say much. He never does, not at first. Alicia Mowbray hadn't come home. The bicycle was hers after all. Still locked, still unclaimed, still whispering the same question it had asked me the night before. Lewis had a tone, the cautious one, where concern wears the overcoat of procedure. I told him I'd meet him at her house. It was a tidy Georgian terrace near the river, red brick and modest, the sort of place academics retreat to when they're done pretending to be young. A cat sat in the window, entirely indifferent to our knocking. The door was unlocked, which meant little and everything. Inside, it was quiet. No signs of struggle. No overturned mugs or smeared footprints. The sort of silence that leans back, hands folded, and invites you to explain yourself. On the small writing desk by the window, a single wine glass, half drunk, or perhaps half forgotten, and beside it, Pearl, the translation by Tolkien, open to stanza 72. The lines blurred under the light, but the final phrase struck me, more joy in a gem than all this world. She'd underlined it, twice, a receipt poked out like a guilty tongue. Bodleian, 2 days prior. Manuscript room. The ink had run slightly where condensation must have bled into the paper. I pocketed it without thinking. Later I'd wonder why she hadn't used something more personal. A bookmark, perhaps. A photograph. But Alicia had always struck people, those who spoke of her, as precise. Not cold, precisely. Just careful. The house smelled of rosemary and floor polish. I wandered briefly. A habit, not an instinct. Nothing was amiss, which of course meant everything was. Upstairs, her bedroom was neat. A dressing gown draped across the end of the bed. A single earring on the bureau, its twin already nestled in the jewelry tray. An absence made visible. I resisted the impulse to comment aloud. Even Lewis, who had followed me in silence, didn't break it. Some moments are like glass, necessary, reflective, and easily broken by explanation. It wasn't until we returned to the car that he mentioned the American. Thorne. Professor Thorne. Visiting scholar from Vermont, researching psalmody in early English liturgy. Shared a few lectures with Alicia, apparently. Spoke highly of her, even if the sentiment wasn't returned in kind. She called him insistent, Lewis said, checking his notebook. And terribly sure of himself. That's not a sin in academia, I muttered. But sometimes it's a warning. We found Thorne an hour later in the quad of Brasenose, smoking in the self-conscious way of men who want to appear thoughtful. He was tall, clean-shaven, the sort who wears a scarf even when there's no wind. He said he'd last spoken to Alicia 2 days earlier, about Gregorian phrasing of all things. She'd seemed distracted, not distressed precisely. Just absent. That word again. Absence, not alarm. He asked if something had happened, and I said we weren't sure yet. He nodded too quickly. There was something about the way he looked at me. Not in the eyes, but near them as though measuring the weight of silence between syllables. I asked if he knew of any reason Alicia might leave her bicycle behind. He smiled, but it didn't reach his forehead. She was always very particular, he said. If she left it, I'm sure she intended to return. I watched the way his hands toyed with the edges of his coat. Nervousness, perhaps, or memory. He excused himself soon after, a tutorial. Apologized even in that clean American way, but I noticed he hadn't asked which chapel we were talking about. He'd never asked if she was missing, only if something had happened. Back in my office, I poured a measure of whiskey and stared again at the crossword. The clue was still unsolved, solo undone, lost in echo. I scribbled dolens in, the margin, Latin for grieving. It didn't fit, but it felt close. And in the distance, through the stone hush of Oxford's morning, the choir rehearsed again, a note too sharp, a harmony waiting for a voice that never came. She was never the sort of woman who filled a room, not in the conventional sense. Alicia Mowbray arrived softly, like a draught under an old door, something you noticed only when it had already disturbed you. 3 people claimed to have known her, and by the end of that day I wasn't entirely sure any of them had. But they each told a version of her, and I've come to suspect that's all anyone ever leaves behind, fragments in other people's voices. First was Professor Graham Iveson, the mentor, if not quite the confidant. I'd admired his early work on Chaucer, though admiration curdles quickly when faced with the real man. His rooms in Merton were lined with the kind of books that aren't so much read as displayed like weapons. Spine out, polished, brittle with age. He offered sherry, not because he thought I wanted it, but because it saved him the trouble of explaining anything. He said Alicia had been under strain, though he wouldn't call it that exactly. She'd taken on too much. Choir, manuscript work, the Thorn lectures. I noted the sequence. She came last. He spoke of her voice the way one speaks of stained glass. Beautiful, yes, but something that belonged in a frame. He paused to recall a particular rehearsal. She'd wept afterward, he said, though it was likely the music. Some are more sensitive than others. I asked if she'd spoken of fear. He tilted his head and said, not fear. No, but perhaps foreboding. He hesitated then, just enough to matter. Said something about a piece she was translating, The Soul's Complaint, obscure Middle English, full of death and guilt. She believed in that sort of thing, apparently. Guilt, as if it were a language to be decoded. I thanked him. He asked whether I'd found her bicycle. The question seemed pointed. I didn't answer it. Evie Durand met me outside the choir vestry, half in rehearsal dress, half in defiance. Her voice was lower than Alicia's, darker too, the kind of mezzo that carried grief like iron filings in velvet. She lit a cigarette she didn't want and told me Alicia was ambitious. Not cruel, but selfish in that airy, unknowing way that people with talent often are. They'd shared solos once. Then Alicia got all the solo work. Politics, Evie said, or purity of tone, depending who you asked. She mentioned an argument. Not quite a fight, but enough. Alicia had insisted on a different rendering of the Kyrie, said the phrase Christ. Have mercy should come from a place of individual despair, not communal hope. I wrote that down, though I wasn't sure why. Evie said she didn't take it personally, though she flicked the ash with more force than required. I asked if she'd noticed anyone unusual around the chapel that week. She looked at me for a long moment, then said she wasn't sure what usual meant anymore. She hadn't seen Alicia leave after the last rehearsal. Just her coat, still hanging in the vestry, and that damned hymn book with the marginalia. I asked what sort of marginalia. She said Alicia used to write tiny annotations next to verses. Sometimes just words, hunger, mercy, undoing. I asked if I could see it. She said it had gone missing. The third was Canon Selwyn. Older, with hands that trembled slightly, but eyes that didn't. We spoke in the chapel, which always feels like a confession even when you're not inclined to confess. He remembered Alicia as precise. Not devout, not exactly, but reverent. She'd requested a change to the program. Psalm 88 instead of Psalm 27. A strange choice, he said. Psalm 88 is a psalm without redemption. No light, no closing note of hope. I nodded. That kind of choice isn't made lightly. He asked me what I thought had happened. I said I didn't know, but I suspected someone had decided Alicia's silence was preferable to her voice. He closed his eyes then, as though trying to hear something distant, perhaps a note that no longer rang, or perhaps guilt. As I left, the choir had resumed. A different piece now, cleaner, lighter, but it felt wrong, as if the absence of her voice hadn't created space, but hollow. Later, in my flat, I found the crossword still unsolved. A new clue caught my eye. Turned solo into prayer, perhaps. San Salter, I murmured. It fit, more or less. But then so did silence. And not everything that fits is right. It arrived folded twice and unsigned, the sort of paper that curls slightly at the corners, as though reluctant to remain within human grasp. The porter at Corpus produced it with an air of mild theatre, as if he'd known all along it might matter. Found in the Morning Post, uncollected, addressed to Alicia Mowbray in a hand that belonged to someone who once wrote regularly and then stopped. The curves were too tentative, the ink too dark. The envelope bore no return address, only her name and the college. Enough in Oxford to find its way to the right pigeonhole. Or the wrong one. He told me he hadn't opened it, though his eyes were the kind that flinch before lying. I didn't press him. Porters have a curious neutrality, halfway between priest and spy. Instead, I took the letter and read it just beyond the arch, where the shadows didn't quite reach. You cannot hide from what was written. It is still there, even if you have rewritten it in silence. Michaelmas, 1989. You remember? I read it again, aloud in my head, the way you do with poems that aren't quite poetry. It wasn't a threat, not directly, but it bled with implication. That year again. 1989. It had surfaced once already, a ripple behind Professor Iveson's carefully composed sentences, the date scrawled faintly on the back of a faculty photograph, nearly rubbed out, but not entirely. Just enough to make me wonder whether it was the date itself that mattered, or the effort to forget it. Lewis met me outside the library, holding 2 paper cups of coffee like he was unsure which one was meant for me. He'd always tried to be helpful that way. I told him about the letter, and he asked the obvious question. Was it blackmail? I said no, or not in the usual sense. It didn't ask for money. It asked for memory. And that's always the costlier thing. The Bodleian manuscripts room was humid, faintly reverent. I watched a young woman in gloves turn a vellum page with the care of someone handling scripture. We found the reading register for the past week. Alicia had signed in on Tuesday. Twice. Once for a 14th century antiphonary, and again, more curiously, for a sealed collection marked Private Correspondence, Faculty Review, 1988-90, access granted by special request. I raised an eyebrow at the librarian, who gave a shrug composed entirely of disapproval. She hadn't liked Alicia, I could tell. Or maybe she didn't like what Alicia had looked for. It was Lewis who spotted the marginal note in the sign-in ledger. In the column for Reason for Access, Alicia had written 3 words: discrepancy in wording. Not error, not omission, discrepancy. A word that lives on the edge of accusation. I imagined her writing it. Firm hand, deliberate pressure. She hadn't come to read history. She'd come to correct it. We walked to the archive office, but the files were gone. Signed out again. Not returned. The name given was Thorn. That, at least, aligned with something. I said nothing, just stared at the librarian's logbook until the shape of the name blurred and reformed itself. Thorn had come late in the day, just before closing. He'd ticked the copying column, though the documents weren't permitted to be reproduced. I asked whether any cameras covered the reading table. The librarian blinked. "We're a library, not a bank," she said. Outside, the sun had fallen too quickly behind Hartford, the bridge casting its usual irony over the cobbles. A closed arch masquerading as connection. I lit a cigarette I didn't need and thought again of the letter. You cannot hide from what was written. The phrasing struck me. Impersonal, but intimate. The kind of thing you say to someone you once loved or once destroyed. I wondered whether, in this case, it had been both. We stopped by the chapel before parting. The bicycle was gone. No one had claimed to move it. No one had seen it taken. No one had seen anything at all. Oxford can be like that. Full of eyes, but rarely witnesses. That night I sat with the letter on my desk, beside a whiskey I'd forgotten to sip. The radio was off, the crossword untouched. I looked again at the photograph from 1989, taken at the end of Michaelmas term. 4 figures, all slightly younger than they had any right to be. Alicia, Iveson, Selwyn, and the 4th scratched away with the careful rage of someone trying not to leave a trace. They had been smiling, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they've just agreed not to talk about something. I've never trusted coincidence. Not in Oxford, where time seems to spiral more than progress, and where disappearances tend to arrive like clock chimes. Singular only in sound, not in intent. When Evie Durand failed to appear at choir practice that Friday afternoon, I felt something shift. Not violently, but with the unsettling stillness of a room where someone has just left without saying goodbye. Lewis rang me from the vestry, his voice reluctant to name what we both sensed. Another absence, another coat left hanging. Her navy blue scarf, the one with the frayed tassel, still curled on the bench like a sleeping cat, her handbag beneath it. But no sign of her since mid-morning. He asked if I thought it was connected. I told him to wait for me. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already begun to feel the shape of it, the hollow that forms not from violence, but from evasion. Some disappear to escape danger, others to provoke it. Her cottage in Jericho stood under the weight of a grey that threatened rain but hadn't yet committed. The door was ajar, not open, just uncertain. I stepped in first, calling nothing, expecting nothing. The kettle was on the hob, just off the boil. A damp tea bag sat on the counter, bleeding into a chipped saucer, the sort of mess one leaves behind only if they intend to return in a moment. The crossword lay on the small kitchen table, half filled in Evie's tall, spare hand. I traced it absently and saw the clues forming a faint constellation. 1 across, a sacred song unravelled, perhaps. 7's canticle. 3 down, feeling after error, softly uttered. 7, remorse. 6 across, offered up entirely. 9, sacrifice. 9 down, absent echo, or echo of absence. 7, silence. I stared at the grid. Not the words themselves, but the arrangement. A cross, a chant, a grief, a void. Lewis found the note behind the teacup. Not a note, precisely. A name. Thorn. Scribbled in what looked like the tip of an eyeliner pencil, faint and urgent. Below it, a line. Ask him about Paris. And then, beneath that, half erased. I only told her because she asked the wrong question. The kitchen smelled of bergamot and whatever it is that silence leaves behind. We returned to Brasenose. Thorn was in the common room, speaking too loudly about something too trivial. He noticed me and the temperature dropped half a degree. I sat beside him and asked whether he'd seen Evie that day. He hesitated, smiled. Not today, no, not in some time. A pause. Perhaps she's gone to visit her sister. She mentioned her sister, I think. I didn't reply, just watched him fidget with the handle of his mug. He drank tea like it was wine, swirling it unnecessarily, examining its color as though it held depth. I asked if he'd ever been to Paris. His eyes lifted quickly. "Once or twice," he said, "but not recently. Not since, a while." I didn't ask about Alicia. I let the quiet do the asking. He adjusted his cuff and said he hoped she was found soon, that she had been gifted. I corrected him. Has. He didn't blink. Later, Lewis informed me Evie's passport had been flagged at Charles de Gaulle that morning. A one-way flight, paid in cash at Heathrow. She had vanished, but not blindly. She had gone towards something, or away from something else. I sat that evening by the fire, the crossword from her table open beside mine. Her answers had bled slightly where a cup had sweated against the page. I held them up to the light, as though they might confess. They didn't, but they made me think. Not of guilt, but of ritual, sacrifice, remorse, canticle, silence. They weren't clues, they were liturgy, and beneath them I began to see the shape of a prayer said backward. I listened to it late. The chapel tapes were delivered by hand, unlabeled but unmistakable. A stack of old Maxells in a canvas bag, with the smell of damp stone and candle wax still clinging to them. The choir master had forgotten they existed, as people often forget the things that might hear too much. They were meant for internal review. Acoustics, balance, diction. No one expected them to hold anything other than poor Latin and better voices. But I've always believed in listening twice. The first tape began in the usual way. Low murmurs, chairs scraping against tile, the creak of robes, someone clearing a throat too often. And then music, clear, reverent, almost too clean. Alicia's voice wove through the others like a ribbon catching wind. It struck me, absurdly, that I missed her already. Not the woman, perhaps, but the echo, the idea of her in harmony. The recording of Tuesday's rehearsal, the last before she vanished, was different, only slightly. But the difference was enough. At time code 1243, during her solo, Domine, exaudi vocem meum, there was a hesitation. Not in the note itself, but in the breath before it. A missed entry. A silence too precise to be accident. A silence that waited. And then a resumption, crisp and committed, as if nothing had happened. I rewound it. Once. Then again. The third time I played it slowed. Not enough to distort, just enough to expose the seams. The breath was shallow, sharp, like someone startled, or realizing something too late. At 15:11, a metallic sound, not loud, not central, but present. I replayed it at higher gain. It wasn't a door, not a chair, not anything inside the chapel. It had a certain lilt, a trill, a bicycle bell. I let that sit for a while. The vestry was unlocked that afternoon. I went alone. Sometimes Lewis's good intentions feel like too much light in the wrong room. The air inside was stale, dust-ribboned. A half-empty bottle of sacramental wine on the shelf. 3 hymnals left unshelved, all dog-eared on Abide With Me. Someone had lit incense recently, though no service had been held since Sunday. The small desk where rehearsal notes were kept bore a faint smudge, not ink, not dust. Grease, perhaps, or wax. I ran a finger along it, and it came away grey. The chair was pushed slightly back, not quite tucked in, as though someone had left in a hurry, or had intended to return but didn't. On the wall above the desk, a corkboard, thumbtacked scraps of program drafts, notices, a lost scarf, and one torn corner of manuscript paper, Alicia's hand unmistakable. Psalm 88, shift line to last position, emphasis on darkness, underlined. I stared at it until the Latin reassembled in my mind. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps. It is the only psalm that ends without hope. I played the tape again in the vestry itself, letting the sound bleed into the silence. At that same moment, the bell. I opened the chapel door and looked out. The bell could not have come from within, not from the courtyard either. The only angle where it might align acoustically was from the back gate, and only if the person stood there long enough for the sound to filter through the stone. Someone had been outside, waiting. The next tape was unfinished, cut short at 20 minutes. A click, a scrape, then nothing. I took it with me. Back home, I poured a whiskey and stared at my crossword. A new clue. Unheard sound of alarm, reshaped in echo. 6. I wrote signal absently, then crossed it out. It was the absence that kept pressing in, the unfinished notes, the half-filled grids, the recordings that ended too soon. Alicia's last rehearsal hadn't been a mistake. It had been a message. The breath wasn't faltering, it was deliberate. The pause wasn't loss, it was punctuation. She had known someone was there, listening, or waiting, or both. And she had left a silence large enough for someone else to step into. It was raining again, the persistent sideways kind that doesn't announce itself, but seeps in nonetheless. Into collars, into thoughts, as into things once believed to be certain. The cloister stones darkened under it, each one a question softened at the edges. I'd come there not for revelation, but for the hush. It's where people retreat when they need walls close and sky far. Professor Iveson was already waiting, his umbrella folded neatly at his feet like a dog trained too well. He looked smaller than usual, or perhaps just diminished. When a man voluntarily places himself among arches, he's rarely seeking escape. He told me it was time to say something. He spoke with the weariness of someone who'd rehearsed this moment for longer than he'd admit. Alicia had confessed something to him years ago, something he'd never been sure what to do with. A sin not hers alone, but one she had carried because it was the most natural thing to do. A substitution of guilt, you might say, in the religious sense. Back in '89, he said, Alicia had lifted several translated stanzas, obscure, but not unreachable, from a visiting scholar, now long dead. She had been desperate then, trying to secure a fellowship, trying to prove herself. The ambition of clever girls, he said with a wistful ache, is rarely indulged as safely as it is in boys. He'd discovered it, of course, but she'd begged him to let it pass. She would bury it, he said, and she did. Rewrote everything. Left not a trace. But someone else hadn't forgotten. She began receiving letters, cryptic ones, the sort that sound harmless aloud but become darker in ink. The one I found in the lodge was not the first, nor, I suspect, the last. She came to him the week before she vanished, distraught. Said someone had found out. She didn't name them, but mentioned that a second file, her original, might still exist in the Bodleian archive, misfiled or preserved by mistake. She had tried to access it. She failed, but she was afraid it hadn't vanished entirely. He believed she was being blackmailed. I asked whether she'd paid. He didn't know. He lowered his eyes as if remembering how it had felt to be chosen as the confessor, but not the savior. I let his words settle. They fit, in a way. The threatened past, the withdrawn rehearsal, the absence. And yet, it fit too soon, as though the puzzle had fallen together with the careless neatness of a child's toy. I asked why he was telling me now. He said because silence had failed, because it had begun to haunt the choir itself. He said the sopranos were turning on each other, that the conductor had grown nervous, that the music no longer flowed but stammered. He handed me a folder. Inside, photocopies of Alicia's early papers, pre-1990. I skimmed them. They read well, too well, polished like cathedral glass, but in the margins, minute notations, Latin glosses, textual variants, were missing. There was no intellectual scaffolding, only final product, as if the argument had arrived fully formed without having passed through doubt. That was the flaw. I asked if anyone else had access to these papers. He said he wasn't sure, that the originals had been stored in a cabinet eventually cleared after Alicia moved apartments. He thought they had been destroyed. He hoped so. We parted without touching hands. Back at the station, Lewis said they'd found Evie Durand, or rather, the French police had. She'd been apprehended at Charles de Gaulle, trying to board a flight to Florence with a forged return ticket and half a suitcase of unwashed clothes. She had no explanation, no apology, only a quiet panic that suggested grief or guilt or something else entirely. She wasn't running from the law, she said, just from something that was about to collapse. She hadn't written the letter. She hadn't spoken to Alicia in days. She hadn't known what was coming, only that something was. She'd lied, yes, but only out of fear of implication. She confessed to the affair, if it could be called that. Confessed that Alicia had grown cold toward her, that she'd said things that, in hindsight, could have been goodbye. I let Lewis take her statement. I no longer trusted the light in the room. That evening I returned to the tape. The bicycle bell, the hesitation, the breath. The truth was still there, but it had been overlaid with something easier to accept. And I've never trusted easy. You don't climb the Bodleian roof to think. You climb it to remember. Or perhaps to feel yourself diminished by stone and sky. That peculiar Oxford condition where the intellect is caged in architecture and the soul measured in echo. It was Thorne's suggestion, oddly enough. He'd mentioned the view with the awkward earnestness of someone who believes scenery redeems character. I said nothing, but I found myself there regardless. It was early evening when I arrived, though the sun had no interest in setting with conviction. Just a slow fade through greys, as if unsure whether the day deserved to be over. The custodian let me through with a nod that suggested familiarity, or at least resignation. Some men haunt libraries by instinct. I do it by inclination. From the roof, Oxford flattens. Domes, spires, and towers reduced to gestures. No students, no sermons, just geometry. I leaned against the stone and lit a cigarette I didn't want. Below, the quad curled into shadow. Somewhere, a bell had already given up for the day. The answer hadn't come, but the question had changed shape. Alicia's archive request. The manuscript correspondence. That phrase again, discrepancy in wording. I hadn't thought enough of it at first. The suggestion was academic, clinical, but Alicia wasn't clinical. She was precise. That's not the same thing. Inside the library, I asked for the request log again, the same handwriting, the same note, but this time I checked the cross-referenced requests. 2 days before Alicia's visit, another scholar had accessed the same folder. Someone else had passed through that narrow gap in the catalogue's gate. I requested the slip. Name, Thorne. M. Purpose, comparative analysis. Notes, cited entry inconsistencies in 1989 editions. It was there in black ink. Not implication. Presence. When I stepped outside, he was already waiting, leaning casually by the eastern parapet, looking down at the Radcliffe camera like a man preparing to write about it in a travel journal. He greeted me with a nod and a faint smile, one that wanted to be misunderstood. I asked how long he'd been up there. He said just long enough to lose track of time. He asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I said no, but I had found what someone wanted buried. He looked away then. Not evasive, reflective. He said Alicia had borrowed a quote from him once, during one of their first conversations. Something about scholarship being the rearrangement of loss. I told him that didn't sound like her. He said maybe not, maybe it wasn't a quote, Maybe she'd said it and he'd taken it. He confessed nothing, but his eyes did the work for him. She had accessed the archive not to hide, but to retrieve. She wasn't fearful of exposure. She was fearful of erasure, that some part of her, of what she had carried for others, would be lost once the names were rearranged and the letters forgotten. She was trying to reclaim something, not conceal it. I asked what she'd found. He said he didn't know, but he thought she had seen enough to decide what she'd done didn't matter anymore. She had moved past guilt. That's what frightened him. There was a pause then. A long one. The kind that doesn't end unless someone breaks it. He asked if I believed in redemption. I said I didn't know, but I believed in silence and in how we fill it. Back in the Bodleians' main hall, a librarian remembered Alicia's last visit. She'd asked to read in the high alcove. An odd choice, barely lit and rarely used. She said she preferred the view. I climbed the spiral stair and sat where she had sat. The windows were dust-rimmed, the light hesitant. She had circled something on the page, faintly, a margin annotation. Not hers. Older ink, half erased. I traced the word with my finger. False witness. It was enough. Not proof, but fracture. Downstairs, a student dropped a book and apologized to the air. I stepped into the dusk again, walking slowly across the quad. The clue in my crossword that night was quiet. Fractured past, reconstructed truth. 9. I didn't fill it in, but the word hovered. Palimpsest. It wasn't the line itself that struck me. It was the certainty with which she'd said it. I remember it now, clearer than I had at the time. Selwyn, recalling Alicia's final rehearsal, had said she'd quoted something during a break, almost offhand. Not as a flourish, but as a kind of punctuation to silence. I held truth in a chalice of tears, she'd said, and then gone quiet. He'd repeated it to me as we stood beneath the stone arch outside the chapel, his breath fogging between the syllables. It had haunted him, he claimed, not because of its beauty, but because he couldn't place it. Neither could I, and that, more than anything, disturbed me. Oxford is full of borrowed wisdom, lines passed through mouths like heirlooms, misattributed, misremembered, often made more elegant by error. But this one, this line, rang with the rhythm of a poet I should have known, and yet it sat just beyond reach, like a bell heard underwater. Back in my flat, I pulled down 3 anthologies and a battered dictionary of quotations. Nothing. Not Herbert. Not Donne. Not even the more melancholic corners of Eliot. I tried searching the phrase as a crossword clue. Vessel for grief-concealing virtue, 6. Nothing came. It wasn't until the second whiskey that I thought to check the college archives. Not Alicia's, but Selwyn's. Clerics are rarely without vanity. I requested his earliest sermon notes, the ones from his days as chaplain in training. The archivist looked at me oddly, but obliged. In those pages I found drafts more confessional than doctrinal, reflections on guilt, transference, the weight of silence. And there, on a half-creased sermon titled On Memory and Mercy, the line. Only it wasn't a quote, it was his, scribbled in the margin beside a discarded paragraph. Truth held in a chalice of tears is the only wine God ever drinks. A line he'd never published, perhaps never even spoken aloud until Alicia did. And suddenly I saw it. Not plagiarism, not in the academic sense, but something far more intimate, shared thought or shared burden. A private phrase, whispered once and then retrieved. Not by accident, but by need. She had said it to remind him, or warn him. When I returned to the vestry, it was empty but not unoccupied. The silence had a weight to it. The hymn books had been replaced on their shelves, but one sat too snugly, spine out, tighter than the rest. I eased it forward. Inside, a page torn, then replaced. Psalm 88 again. But the bottom verse, the final absence, had been annotated in a different hand. I recognized it immediately. Selwyn's older, shakier, but unmistakable, and mine acquaintance into darkness. Beneath it, she knew. It wasn't clear whether that was confession or lament. When I found him, he was pacing the side aisle, hands clasped as if in prayer or penitence. He didn't ask why I was there. He only said she always listened too closely, always noticed what others missed. I said that was a gift. He said it was a sentence. He spoke slowly then, each word polished by reluctance. There had been a moment, years ago. One of those moments Oxford makes possible and unforgivable in equal measure. A gesture misread, a line crossed, nothing criminal, not quite. But enough. Enough to echo. Enough to be remembered by the wrong person at the wrong time. She had protected him then, with silence, with erasure, had rewritten what happened into something ambiguous enough for both of them to live with, and she had lived with it, until someone else found the original manuscript, as it were. He said he hadn't written the letters, but he suspected who had, and he was tired. I left him standing there, among the unlit candles and the scent of old stone. That night I couldn't sleep. The crossword stared back blankly. I tried filling it in. Unattributed grief, repurposed, 7. I tried borrowed, then misused. Neither fit. In the end, I wrote spoken, not because it was right, but because it was honest. Outside, the bells rang Vespers again, but it was a different silence now, one that knew it had been overheard. There's a silence that falls after the last note of a choir rehearsal, not the kind filled by scraping chairs or quiet murmurs, but a moment so complete it feels like the building has exhaled. That night it came sooner than it should have. No final chord, no conductor's hand lowering with satisfaction, just an unfinished cadence left dangling in the nave like a thread uncut. I stood in the back of the chapel, unseen. The choristers didn't look at one another. They didn't need to. Absence had taught them what not to say. Afterward, I lingered in the cloister, watching them file out one by one, robes folded over arms, sheet music pressed tight against chests. Evie had returned from Paris by then. Not charged, not cleared. Just returned. She didn't meet my eye as she passed. Iveson was nowhere to be seen. Thorne had left Oxford, his lectures cancelled without apology, his name removed from the door by noon. Only Selwyn remained, lighting a single candle at the front before extinguishing it again, as though the gesture were enough. He didn't turn around. I didn't interrupt him. It was Lewis who found the bicycle. Not where it had been, not chained to the chapel gate or left against the vestry wall, but tucked behind a maintenance shed at the back of the quadrangle. Not hidden, not revealed. It had been placed, curated. A final exhibit in a gallery that no longer admitted guests. The rear reflector was cracked, the smudge still visible, the same daffodil petal, brittle now, like yellowed vellum. Nothing removed, nothing added. A pause preserved in metal. Lewis said the gardener had seen a man wheeling it there in the early hours. A man in clerical garb, though it might have been a gown. Might have been a coat. Might have been memory, conveniently shaped by morning fog. There were no fingerprints, no note, no name scratched into the frame. But it was Alicia's. Returned, not recovered. And in its quiet return, something else came clear. At the vestry, I unlocked the cabinet with a key I hadn't returned. I found the original rehearsal tapes, the ones no one had digitized. Side B of the final cassette had been recorded over. A faint hum. Then the choir, distorted slightly by age. Then a voice. Alicia's. Not singing, speaking. The sentence was brief, half swallowed by reverb. If you find this, it means I didn't undo what I should have. That was all. No explanation, no date, no plea. just the weight of something unconfessed. I let the tape run until it clicked. That night, I visited the chapel again. Empty now, save for scaffolding where the organ was being restored. I stood beneath the west window, the one with the fractured angel. The light was watery, but persistent, and I thought about guilt, about the ways it passes between people like a candle, not to burn, but to illuminate. Alicia had carried guilt that wasn't hers, but she'd also kept silence that protected those who deserved none. And someone afraid of what truth might do to reputation, to order, to Oxford, had chosen to keep that silence permanent. Lewis called me just before midnight. Iveson had been found in the cloister garden. Cold. Not dead, but nearly. A bottle of port beside him, and in his pocket a copy of Pearl marked at the stanza Alicia had left open on her desk. He said later, in words broken more by breath than emotion, that he hadn't meant to hurt her. He'd only meant to delay the reckoning, to give her time to forget, to unremember what she'd come to know. She'd gone to confront him, that much was clear, but the confrontation hadn't ended in violence, not of the visible sort, only panic, only delay. And by the time he returned to the vestry, she'd already fallen, or slipped, or been left too long in silence. He'd panicked, yes, but Oxford taught him how to compose a face, a routine, a perfectly plausible absence. He'd taken the bicycle. He'd locked it, then unlocked it, then moved it again, not to deceive, but to delay, the way guilt delays, the way truth echoes. I filed the report, left the formalities to Lewis. That evening I stared at my crossword. Clue. Kept unspoken, it returns altered, 7. I wrote silence, then softly, beside it, echoed. Neither was wrong. Both were true.